Well, hello there, friends and family. So glad to see you again. And you might be wondering why we're sitting here staring at this cartoon, or a picture of a cartoon. Now, many of y'all, well, about 82% of y'all, which are like me, baby boomers here on the community of the channel, will remember this, I'm sure. This is the beloved turtle, Bert. And we saw this starting at our tender young ages in our schools. It was a film, cartoon film, that they played during our kindergarten, elementary years, even up into middle school and high school, depending on your age at the time. And it started in 1951 and continued on through the 50s and the 60s. We'd also see old Bert on our Saturday morning cartoons. Yes, we would. And what Bert was trying to tell us, not only in this picture, but in the cartoon, which you can also see right here on YouTube if you type in duck and cover, was that he was smart. But he has a shelter on his back, and you must learn to find shelter. Now you might wonder, we were just coming out of World War II, and of course World War II, there were all the bombings, and then there were two of the last bombs that would ever be dropped on another country, and as of yet, have yet to ever be dropped on a country. And you might wonder what that was. Well, I'm sure y'all remember. Those were the atomic bombs that were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima in Japan. And because of them, it forced Japan to surrender, and World War II was finally over. But the devastation, the loss of life, and the long-lasting consequences were yet to be even conceived. It also started another period in our lives, and that period was between what was the two emerging superpowers of the new world after World War II, that being the U.S. and the Soviet Union, the United Soviet Socialist Republics. Yep. And there was still a war. One that's not often talked about and rarely remembered, and that was the Cold War. But unlike Bert here, in that we lived in this reality every day from the end of World War II up until the fall of the USSR, the Soviet Union, on December of 1991. When the Soviet Union finally did fall, then there was a sigh of relief, not only in the U.S., and I'm sure also in the former Soviet states, but throughout the world. Because it was believed that that threat of not only atomic, but later on in the years to come, thermonuclear war had come to an end. But had it? As we all know, the U.S., Russia, and now so many countries have thousands of nuclear warheads, as well as bombs. The U.S. still has an arsenal of not only atomic, but thermonuclear weapons. Some that make Hiroshima look like nothing. But back during the 50s, I can remember Bert. I can remember watching the cartoons in our classrooms and seeing old Bert show up during the Saturday morning cartoons that were a staple throughout the U.S. back in that day. Yeah, we didn't have the Cartoon Network, kids. Nope, we just had cartoons on Saturday morning. And come noon, they were over for the week. But what was Bert showing us? and why was it important? Now here we see the picture that I'm sure so many of y'all remember too. What duck and cover meant. Whenever the air raid sirens would go off, we were instructed and trained to duck and seek cover. Under our desks is what's pictured here. Under tables, under archways, in our basements, our root cellars, or if we were privileged enough, as many millions of American households were during the time, our own personal fallout shelters to avoid the consequences of atomic weapons and nuclear weapons that haunted us every day of our lives. But there would come a day in my life in the tender age of 6, and that day would be in October of 1962, when I would be sitting in class in Howell Elementary School in Lawton, Oklahoma, just outside of Fort Sill, U.S. Army base. And on that particular day in October, not sure which it was, my father showed up at the school. He entered my classroom, went over to speak to my teacher. In hushed voices, we couldn't tell what he was saying, but I noticed my teacher nodded, pointed me out. My father walked up to my desk and looked down. He said, "Tommy, we have to go now." He grabbed my hand, and out the door we went, out to the parking lot and in the car. We would take a short ride just some 3 or 4 blocks away to where our home was in Lawton. And he'd pick up my mother, my younger sister Kathy, and my baby brother Randy. Things were frantic as he loaded every one of us into the car again. And off we would speed back to the base, which was Fort Sill. There we would find our bunker, and he placed us inside. He gave instructions to my mother that once he shut the door, we would not open it again until he returned. And off he went. And what was the crisis that was happening on that October day in 1962? Well, it was one of just a few days where the U.S. would be within minutes on the brink of a nuclear exchange between the U.S. and Russia over Soviet missiles being placed on Cuban soil, right in the American back door. And it was then that John F. Kennedy, the president at the time, was our commander-in-chief and was contemplating the use of nuclear weapons, nuclear missiles, against Russia, should those missiles not be removed from Cuban soil. And my mother, me, my sister, and my younger brother waited out in the bunker for my father's return and any news of what was going on. As history would prove, the USSR, Soviet Union, backed down, and they pulled the missiles from Cuba. Because of that decision, it averted a total exchange of nuclear weapons between the two superpowers of the time. You see, that was a real fear every day of those who grew up in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and even though during the 80s it got less and less, then the world, like I say, had a sigh of relief in the 90s when the USSR fell and the only superpower remaining was the US. But those times have changed. And that's what we're here to talk about today. And that talk is about whether that fear that we once all lived through could possibly ever become a reality again. I think anybody with any education at all understands the consequences of a nuclear exchange on the planet. Once one is fired, you might as well send them all. Now I'm going to take you to an article that led me to relive the memories of my past. Now before we go to the article, I've got this here graphic right here. And you might understand what it means. On the left is the Chinese flag. On the right is the flag of Japan. And in the middle is a mushroom cloud of a thermal nuclear weapon. One we have not seen in many a year since above ground testing was finally stopped between all nations by a treaty. I'm not going to go into the details, but above ground tests are forbidden under a treaty throughout the US, the USSR, China, and all other nuclear nations. But this here graphic is very significant to what we'll be talking about today. So with all that said, we're going to get on to the article that spurred me to remember and to rethink the early days of my life and the consequences should it all come to pass again. Now, before I start, I'd like to say I'm not all about fear. I'm not a fear porn channel. But this caught my eye when it came up on my news feed. And it caught my eye even a little bit more because it didn't come up from one of those conspiracy theory sites or prepper sites that's always promoting gloom and doom. Now, it is mainstream media, so you take that however you wish. But it's from Newsweek. And it says right here, China officials share viral video calling for atomic bombing of Japan. Now we all know atomic bombs have been preceded by nuclear weapons, and there is a big difference. Most nuclear warheads now are hydrogen nuclear bombs or missiles. They far out exceed the devastation of what was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which were atomic. But for Japan, being the only country that has ever had atomic weapons dropped upon their population, that fear is still a not too distant memory. And that's why I am thinking that this headline holds so much credence and so much power to the Japanese people. And you might wonder why. Well, if this is China threatening Japan, why I in the U.S. would be worried about that. Well, Japan is a close ally to the U.S. It's part of the NATO nations. And that being said, we have made the commitment as a nation to defend Japan should it ever come under attack. So let's get into the article. I'll read it and we'll go from there. Like it says right here, Communist Party officials in northwestern China appear to be advocating a continuous atomic bombing of Japan after their social media account shared a controversial viral video over the weekend. Still live on YouTube, like platform, Zhigu, under an account run by Beijing Municipal Committee of the Communist Party of China, that's the CCP. The video calls for Beijing to launch nuclear strikes on Japan if Tokyo intervenes in the Chinese invasion of democratic Taiwan. And if you haven't been keeping up with it, Japan came out officially and said they would stand with Taiwan in their defense should China try to invade Taiwan. Yeah, that was just a couple of days ago. The 5-minute clip was created by a verified military commentary channel, Lujon Talu. The original was posted on Sunday and later deleted after amassing more than 2 million views, but not before it was reposted by the official, and this is what's important, the official party account in Baji, Shunix province. The narrator in the video proposes a Japan exception theory that would see Tokyo exempt from China's no first use nuclear policy. The footage is filled with belligerent and nationalistic rhetoric, as well as threats of nuclear war against one of China's nearest neighbors, that being Japan. The commentator points to recent remarks by high-ranking Japanese officials as the motivation behind his proposal. Japan's defense minister, Nobuo Kishi, and his deputy, Yushu Hide Nakayama, have spoken in support of Taiwan's security in the face of increasingly assertive China. And I think everybody's aware of the tensions between China and Taiwan, and my heart goes out to the Taiwanese. I have several viewers there, as well as several long-time old friends. Taro Aso, Japan's deputy prime minister, also made headlines last week when he suggested a Chinese attack on Taiwan would threaten Japan's survival, necessitating a collective defense of the self-ruled island with U.S. forces. Sunday's controversial video calls on the Chinese leadership not only to retaliate against any Japanese troops that come to Taiwan's aid, but also declare all-out war against Tokyo for intervening in its unification plans. When we liberate Taiwan, if Japan dares intervene by force, even if it only sends one soldier, one plane, or one ship, we will not only return fire, but also start a full-scale war against Japan, the commentary says. First, we will use nuclear bombs. We will continue to use nuclear bombs until Japan offers its second unconditional surrender, it adds. You might wonder why they point out second unconditional surrender. Well, the very first unconditional surrender that Japan would ever make during its history was to the U.S. after dropping of the atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, which ended World War II. So there's the fear. There's a fear that's real for Japan. They have been the only country to live the destruction and the long-term consequences of a nuclear war. We want to strike Japan's capacity to endure war. As soon as Japan recognizes that it cannot afford to pay the price of war, it will not dare send troops to the Taiwan Strait, the narrator continues. The clip posted by BOG Communist Party account has received several hundred comments, all of which appeared to support the video's proposal, which advocates a rethink of China's NFU policy amid major changes in the surrounding security environment. All policies, tactics, strategies must be adjusted, the video says, in order to protect the peaceful rise of our country. See, China now is a superpower, and they want to arise to being the number one superpower on the face of the planet. You would think people and governments would give up on this. But then again, you would think the U.S. would too. You would think that countries would let other countries be and live out within their boundaries as they so do desire. I've often prayed for that, but it has not come to pass. As Japan is the only country to have experienced the effects of an atomic bomb, The commentary suggests a Chinese deterrence policy in which it could launch an atomic strike under certain conditions and will prove doubly effective by singling out Japan as an exception to our first no-use commitment. We are warning Japan that the world, if Japan intervenes militarily in our domestic affairs, including the unification of Taiwan, nuclear weapons will be used against Japan and will be used continuously until its unconditional surrender, the footage concludes. You see, not only is this a warning to Japan, who came out in defense of Taiwan, but it's a warning to all nations on the planet that should you interfere, they will use their nuclear weapons, which they have a vast stockpile as well, should that happen. He neither addresses the likelihood of either scenario nor any adverse effects a nuclear strike on a nearby country would cause to China's major coastal cities. And it says here Newsweek has contacted the Beijing Communist Party Committee for a comment. As you might understand, they haven't. So why is this important for the U.S., for you and me and all of us baby boomers who can remember the Cold War? Remember old Bert the Turtle and the duck and cover drills, as well as the drills and that we did in our homes, that we participated with if we were part of military families. There were times when we were trained and drilled to find our local fallout shelters. It's just like this sign here. It's seen its better days. It's all aged and rusty. But all throughout America at one time, you would see these civil defense signs. And they were quite common, and we all understood what they meant. We, again, were trained in school, as well as television, to recognize this sign and know what it meant. And it is a nuclear fallout shelter. And it would be in the basements of prominent buildings through all cities and small towns. In fact, here in my little small town, Tallahassee, Alabama, I can still find that sign on a couple of buildings. Primarily bank buildings and city courthouses. The problem being, though, now, they're no longer upkept. They're no longer stocked with supplies. They're no longer readily available for us to find, use, and survive a nuclear war. In fact, most of them are used for extra storage now, and have been for over 30 years. So should China be of their word and go ahead and invade Taiwan, which in all instances it does appear they are going to do. They've been building up their navy, building up their amphibious forces, and their constant rhetoric all aims at the fact that they have every intention of reunifying Taiwan, which they look at as a rogue state, with mainland China. And this current warning, not only to Japan, but the entire world, tells what they will do and their stark resolve to make all that happen. Now, you might be saying, well, Mr. Tom, it's nothing we can do and nothing to worry about. And you are exactly right. We as everyday American citizens, as well as those in Japan and all other countries of the world, have little we can do. Sadly, we will not stand up and say, no, we will not allow this to happen. You see, our governments control our fate just as much as the weather controls hurricanes and tornadoes, and Mother Earth controls earthquakes. We are powerless as one individual. The only way we could possibly avert this is if we stood up in masses. And those masses would have to be extreme. Now, how can we prep for this? Because it's just like I say. should China decide to drop or launch nuclear weapons against Japan, well, Japan being an ally of the United States and NATO, all the NATO nations will come together in the defense not only of Japan, but of Taiwan against China. But there's a new axis of power that has come to the top here of late in the last few months. China being the newly emerging superpower that it is, Russia has joined hands with them, as well as Iran. We have seen this in the crises now happen in Cuba. China, Russia, and Iran have both came out publicly and said the U.S. should not interfere in the affairs of China. But it's not the first time that Russia or Iran has come forward publicly and backed China. If you don't know what the Axis powers are, that term comes from World War II, when the Axis powers were Germany, Japan, and Italy during the course of World War II against the Allied powers. So there you have it. It was because of this article that I read, that I do put some credence to, since it is Newsweek, and I know it's mainstream media, that brought up memories of my childhood, teenage years, and young adulthood, of the worrisome probability of any day of total thermal nuclear war exchange between superpowers. But should we live our lives with fear? Are there things we can do to prepare? Well, yes, there are. Depending on your proximity from a blast, you could, as many of my family did back during the 50s and 60s, you can build your own private bunker. And there are still out there today civil defense brochures that tell you exactly how to do that. How deep it has to be, what to use to insulate you from the radiation, what you will need as far as air purification, supplies, water, and what have you. Other than that, we can do very little. So, in my mind, since I don't have the funds to do any of all that, and fallout shelters, stocked and supplied, no longer exist, I have to hope that sanity prevails and our Almighty God will shut it down. And for that, all I can do is pray for His grace and guidance. So I'll leave you tonight with our good old friend, long forgotten, Bert the Turtle. And in hopes that we do not relive the nightmare that is atomic or nuclear war. But I do know this, and I do know the policy of the U.S. as well as other nations. Once one is used, you might as well send them all. Once upon a time, that was seen as mutual destruction. It was a deterrent. But apparently China now considers itself immune from the consequences. Maybe it thinks the U.S., now that it's backed by Russia and Iran, will not have the backbone to stand up and do what it must under the NATO treaty. Who knows? But my point to the video is not to instill fear, but hopefully to stir you to sharing this video, talking it over with your friends and your family, your neighbors, and getting the word out that this cannot be allowed to happen. And should we raise this up to a social upheaval, maybe like the Vietnam War and so many other issues that have risen to the top in this world, we can avert what will almost always be a disaster. It is my hopes that we can raise this up to the point that it goes viral on social media, where we as a people all across this planet will say this cannot happen. We will not allow it. And we will stand as one for the very first time. And we will shut this down. And we will call for peace, and that all nations will live within their own boundaries. And let all others be, and I'm calling out the U.S. to do that as well. With all of that, y'all, I do hope this all finds y'all safe, well, and happy in your homes with your friends, family, and loved ones. Take it for what it is. Worry as you must. There's no worrying. For something of this nature, we can only leave in God's hands. With all that said, I bid you adieu and good night. And may God bless each and every one of you as you bless others. Goodbye for now.